Hey everybody, and welcome back to video 4 on my 5-part video series where I break down the results of my PhD and make it more accessible to everyone in esports. This video, we want to understand how mental toughness impacts the stress and coping process in esports. Let's jump right in. Disclaimer, I've said this at the start of every video and I'll say it again in the 5th video. I'm not a registered psychologist. The content of this video should not be used instead of seeking professional help. Don't suffer in silence. If you're struggling, reach out. So, title of study 3, Stress and Coping in Esports and the Influence of Mental Toughness. If you want to read more, links in the description below. This one's open access, so anyone can view it from anywhere. This is a really interesting study. So, study aim. We wanted to examine the stress and coping process in competitive esports athletes, and we wanted to explore how this process might be influenced by mental toughness. And this is how that model looks. So, you'll notice, for those of you that have been following along and who have watched videos 1, 2, and 3, you'll notice that event, appraisal, coping, and outcomes, that's the same as the CMRT, cognitive, motivational, relational model of stress and coping that we've already talked about, that I've explained twice now throughout the video. So if that doesn't make sense to you, this video is going to be really hard for you to follow along with. Jump back at video 1. Jump back up into video 1 and that'll be all explained for you in great detail. What we're interested in this study is that little box at the top of the diagram here, personality factors, and specifically mental toughness. Now you'll see that there's 2 black arrows pointing out to the left from mental toughness that touch event and appraisal, and then there's 2 more arrows that are blue touching from mental toughness to coping and outcomes. Now, how am I best to explain this? What we know from traditional sport is that people's personality impacts the events that they engage in. So if you're someone who's really confident, it's called the differential exposure hypothesis. I'm just trying to think how I can explain it really simply. Your personality determines can determine which events you decide to engage in. Confident, self-assured person, I might be more attracted to competitive events. Or I might just have a personality. I might just be someone who likes competition. Whereas someone who isn't geared that way might not engage in competition as much. I use the word competition because in this example, that's where I think mental toughness could be impactful. If you're someone who's not into competition, you don't like the bright lights and the competitive stage, and you're not geared towards doing that, it's very unlikely that you're going to find yourself at a competitive esports event. So that's what that first arrow is. Our personality impacts what things we choose to engage in. The most important arrow on this, and this is one that I unpack a lot more as we go through the video, is how mental toughness links to appraisal. So I said in video 1, if you're someone who's more confident, you might perceive that you have a lot of internal resources. A big part of mental toughness that I'll touch on in a second is confidence. So our personality might impact how the events we engage in, how we perceive the stressor, and how we perceive our own internal amount of resources to overcome the stressor. And that's what we're going to explore in this study. Also, obviously with the blue arrows, mental toughness might indirectly, therefore, impact coping and coping outcomes or coping effectiveness. Because if our mental toughness impacts our appraisal, that's going to impact our coping strategies. And that's why the arrows go from black to blue. But I'll explain that more as we go through the video. Really quickly, what is mental toughness? Now, in my thesis, I kind of explored 2 views of mental toughness. Do not ever bother yourself with going into the mental toughness literature. It is a wash with different opinions, different definitions, and so I just chose 2 of the most prominent ones and researched them. The first one was developed by Clough and colleagues in 2002. This states that mental toughness is built of 4 elements: challenge, commitment, control, and confidence. And more recently, that's been broken down into 6 elements. So you have your challenge and your challenge and commitment. Then you have your control over your life. So how much control do you perceive you have over your own life? And how much control do you have over your emotions? So some of you are straight away going, oh, if you're someone who has a high degree of control over your emotions, you're probably better at emotion-focused coping. You'll start to see the links hopefully more and more as we go through. Confidence is broken down into interpersonal confidence and confidence in your own abilities. And some of you, again, will be going, well, that's going to impact secondary appraisal probably, because if you've got a lot of confidence in your own ability, you might perceive that you have a lot of control to change the stressor, or you have a lot of resources to deal with the stressor when you're doing secondary appraisal. Hopefully you're starting to see some of those links. The other mental toughness definition that we explored is Gucciardi's from 2015, and that's a 7-component model, and we call it a unidimensional model because it gives you one score. So you have one number that represents your mental toughness, whereas in the 6-component model built off of Clough's work, you have 6 different numbers. You get a score for challenge, a score for commitment, a score for control, and that's going to be important for you to remember, because when I go through the results and I say things like, well, control impacted appraisal in these ways, I'm talking about Clough's measurement. Whereas when I say things like mental toughness overall or total mental toughness score, I'm talking about Gucciardi's measurement. And I know that's an unnecessary degree of complication. A lot of people prefer Clough's because it has got those nice 6 elements, but I do need to state that at the start so that you know what I'm talking about. I won't go into any more details. I won't go into any more details. It doesn't help anyone. So who were the participants for this study? Well, there was 316 e-athletes, and they played Rainbow Six Siege, Overwatch, Counter-Strike, League of Legends, and Dota 2. They were also in the top 40% of their chosen esport game, determined by in-game rank. So, as I've already touched on, I'll bring me back onto the screen here. This was done by questionnaires. The surveys in the questionnaire collected stress appraisal, coping, and mental toughness information because we wanted to see that back half of the stress and coping process, how that was impacted by people's levels of mental toughness. It might be a little small, and I apologize if you're struggling to read that, but I've left the reference there. It's on Google. If you just Google brief cope Carver 1997, you'll get more information on these. These were the coping strategies that we quizzed people on in the coping questionnaire that I talked about on the last slide. Self-distraction, active coping, denial, substance use, use of emotional support, use of instrumental support, behavioral disengagement, venting, positive reframing, planning, humor, acceptance, religion, and self-blame. Now, some of you, as I'm reading through them, are going, well, that's a problem-focused coping strategy because active coping, you're actively dealing with the stressor. Or acceptance, well, that's definitely an emotion-focused coping strategy because you're dealing with your internal state. And behavioral disengagement, for example, well, you're disengaging. That's a avoidance coping strategy. Really well done if you're starting to give them those names, because then you can start associating those names with effectiveness. Well, when I use problem-focused coping, that's more effective for me. I'm going to keep doing problem-focused coping strategies. These are the things I'm hoping that some of you are starting to develop in your repertoire as we go through unpacking these. Moving on. So what were the results? What did these 316 competitive and elite e-athletes tell us about mental toughness and tell us about stress and coping? When e-athletes have higher levels of emotional and life control, so that's one of those mental toughness control, higher levels of control, both emotional and life control, they had less stress intensity. So again, this isn't proven, but what this might mean is that people with higher levels of control or perceived control over their life have a lower stress response. So if you're working with your sports psychologist and you're going, I always think things are the most intense ever, so much stress intensity for me, you might need to work with your sports psychologist to increase your emotional control and your life control. Overall mental toughness was not associated with stress intensity. So the total level of mental toughness didn't have any association with stress intensity. Players reported stresses as both a threat and a challenge. Now, if you remember, that's getting pretty conceptual, but we still don't understand in esports, and this supports study too, which lower order stresses are more likely to be seen as a threat and a challenge. And for players, you're probably going, that doesn't mean much, but for sports psychologists, that does mean something, and just take note of that. Coping and mental toughness. Overall mental toughness, so the 2 mental toughness questionnaires that I talked about earlier in the video. Higher levels of mental toughness, higher levels of problem-focused coping strategies. That's what we see in traditional sport as well. I talked about that in video 3. High levels of mental toughness also increase lead to higher problem-focused coping strategy selection. Overall levels of mental toughness, so the higher your mental toughness level, the less avoidance coping that you use. Interestingly, overall mental toughness was also associated with the strategy acceptance. Now that ties back into the results from video 3, study 2, where we talk about both problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping seem to be important in esports. If you're someone that's really struggling with tilt, for example, or stresses that require an emotion-focused coping strategy, more mentally tough people report using acceptance coping strategies. So you might want to learn, go to your sports psychologist, work with a professional, or do your own research and try to employ better acceptance coping strategies. Look up MAC training, mindfulness, acceptance and commitment training. That could be really, really helpful for you. Mental toughness in general. So players with higher in-game rank tended to have higher mental toughness. Now this isn't if you have high, you can't be good at esports if you don't have high mental toughness. It just suggests that the two are associated with each other. If you're working with your sports psychologist, your team manager, whoever you're working with, maybe doing your own research, you might find that improving your mental toughness, building your mental toughness skills, improving those 6 elements that we talked about earlier, that could increase your in-game rank, and it could be because you better cope with stress because of it. An interesting stat that will be relevant to sports psychologists and potentially future researchers watching this is that the MTI and the MTQ had a low shared variance, which means the 2 of them, Gucciardi and Clough's version of the mental toughness questionnaire, might be measuring different elements of mental toughness. Just keep that in mind. So what were the main study 3 findings? Similar to traditional sport, personality factors like mental toughness appear to influence the stress and coping process in e-athletes. Mental toughness was associated with achievement level in esports. So just like in traditional sport, if you can improve your mental toughness, or if you are more mentally tough, that's going to help your rank in game, or that could help your game in rank, and it will help you better deal with stress. Keep that in mind. I know that some of you are kind of going, well, you've said mental toughness is really important, but I don't know how to work with that. That's a future study I plan to run. I couldn't do the effectiveness of a mental toughness training program with this group because it was just survey research. The key takeaways for this, for sports psychologists, team managers, and players, is that mental toughness might be important in esports. These results suggest that it is important in esports. Let's help our players become more mentally tough. It'll help them better cope with stress. It'll help them achieve higher in-game ranks. That was a shorter video. That wraps up mental toughness and stress in esports. That was the 4th video in the video series. We've now talked about what is stress, the sources of stress, stress and coping, the whole process in esports, how mental toughness impacts stress and coping in esports. The last video, we'll be looking at the psychology of elite e-athletes. Thank you for sticking around.